Making it to the NBA seems to be a guarantee of a life that most can only dream of. But what happens when that life turns into a living nightmare? These 5 NBA players made it to the top, only to see the dark side of their own success. Starting with Ben Gordon, whose fall from the NBA was darker than you could have possibly believed. Ben Gordon during his time reached some pretty incredible highs. As a very high-volume scorer at UConn, Gordon's play excited fans and scouts alike. As an athletic and crafty little guard, Ben Gordon could score in bunches, putting up 19.5 a game as a sophomore, and at 42% from deep on 6 a game, this kid could shoot the piss out of the ball. Leading UConn in scoring as a junior on their way to a national championship finish, the world was certainly in his hands. Everyone had their eyes on this kid. And as the Chicago Bulls would snatch him up 3rd overall in the 2004 NBA draft, he would very quickly find his role in the league. In just his rookie year, Ben Gordon would win the league's 6th Man of the Year award, totaling 15 points a night on 40% from 3. Ben Gordon was a spark plug through and through. And not only would he ignite an offense night after night, but also gave the Chicago fans something to cheer for as they were still in the wake of the post-Michael Jordan era. Year after year, Gordon was climbing the ladder amongst the best scorers to do it in the league, peaking in his 2007 campaign at 21 points per game on over 41% from 3. When it came to putting the ball in the basket, really, Ben Gordon is one of the most underrated in the era, and had he played post-2015, he for sure wouldn't be forgotten as he is. Gordon would bet on himself in the following offseason, turning down a generous 6-year, $58 million extension in hopes of receiving an even higher offer the following year. However, as that would not come, Gordon would lose the contract war, settling for a single-season, $6 million offer. As Gordon and the Bulls had a bit of a down year in the 2008 season, the lottery balls certainly blessed them in a major way, giving them Chi-Town's own Derrick Rose. Playing alongside another guard, it was a bit of an unorthodox fit, but being able to take the role as a shooter and shot creator with Rose handling his playmaking weakness and the supporting Bulls cast carrying the defensive load, Gordon could do what he was best at, and these Bulls were scary. At 41-41, they may not have seemed like the greatest roster in the world as an unassuming 7 seed going up against the defending champions, but little did the world know that on the back of Ben Gordon, this could have very well been the best playoff series ever played. 7 games, 7 overtimes, Derrick Rose and Noah's introduction to the playoffs, and unfortunately Gordon's last game in a Bulls uniform, because this is the series that got him paid. Highlighted by a 42-point explosion in Game 2, Gordon led all scorers this series at 24 points per game in this back-and-forth slugfest. Trust me. Once this thing was over, there certainly was a fan who didn't know the name Ben Gordon, and having taken advantage of the opportunity, Gordon landed himself a 5-year, $55 million contract as a reward. Unfortunately, Gordon would not be able to stay in Chicago on his pursuit of the big bucks, and double unfortunately, he would land in Detroit, who would fail to win over 30 games throughout his tenure. On a team that couldn't even sniff the playoffs, Gordon would see consistent and immediate drop-offs in production and efficiency, falling below league average from the 3-point line into 13 to 11, down and down, before eventually, after a few unassuming visits to a few unassuming teams, Gordon had one of the most mysterious disappearances in league history. The reason for it could be mental, could be an X's and O's issue in Detroit, or just an early athletic peak and decline, or a combination of which. But even for one of the worst fall-offs I've ever seen, this has nothing on the news that Gordon made after his NBA run. The rest of this video gets pretty graphic, involving mental illness, violence, sexual assault, and self-harm, so if any of that may trigger you, the rest of the video is not for you. Viewer discretion is advised. Following the commencement of a G League season, the beginning of many strange occurrences regarding Ben Gordon's off-the-court behavior occurred, as Gordon would be arrested in his apartment for pulling the fire alarms on a typical Thursday morning. With very nonchalant and half-joking coverage of the situation, this was only the beginning of a man who would quickly see his life fall apart. In October 2017, just 5 months after his fire alarm incident, Gordon would send out numerous videos threatening and daring them to pull up to his gym. Clearly unwell, these videos were taken just days before Gordon would violently lash out at a woman in his gym. Following a reported argument, Gordon would lock a young woman in his newly opened gym in Illinois before throwing everything in the vicinity in a violent rage. Gordon would refuse to let the woman leave until police arrived as he stood in the back watching with a knife. As police arrived, Gordon would be transported to a psychiatric hospital before he was released. Just 1 month later, and police would once again be called due to Gordon's erratic behavior, resulting in violence. Gordon was accused of punching the manager of a downtown apartment complex where he was renting, pulling a knife on the man, and taking money that Gordon said was his security deposits. Gordon was then arrested before spending the weekend in a Los Angeles jail before being released on a $50,000 bond. After this point, it appeared to be radio silence for 27 months, until Ben would break his silence in a very vulnerable way. Gordon explained the way his mind and his life spiraled after his days in the NBA, explaining the mental anarchy that was occurring behind the scenes. According to Gordon, immediately after his exit from the NBA, his mind betrayed him in a way that he didn't understand. After spending his life competing physically with a strict routine, staff, and support system around him, when the world expected him to drop his whole lifestyle cold turkey, he lost what was his sense of identity and what was the main distractor that he was chasing. Now with nothing but the thoughts in his head, Gordon would suffer panic attacks so bad, it felt that a black cloak was thrown on him, suffocating him physically and suffocating him spiritually. All he could think about was escape. He had to escape his own mind. Waking up every morning to the same thoughts, the same shadow that would lead him to the edge of the apartment rooftop where he would pace back and forth, just thinking to himself, I'm really going to escape. Gordon would battle with these thoughts for months on end to the point of tying his own noose, only to go back into the real world, only to be treated as the psychotic, washed-up has-been who has clearly lost his mind. Gordon would battle the same obsession that got him into the league in the first place on a nightly basis, living as an insomniac among us, hallucinating that what he was doing was normal. Gordon referred back to his visit in the psychiatric hospital as what he thought was unjustified, as if it was just some misunderstanding. I mean, he's Ben Gordon. Of course he can't be strapped down by nurses and sedated in a hospital bed, but in the eyes of everyone else, he was closer to the guy you walk quickly past laying on the side of the street than the celebrity you want to grab a picture with. After court-mandated therapy, Gordon unexpectedly found great purpose and relief in being able to just speak about what he was feeling, and found out that there were even words and conditions to describe what he was experiencing, and felt comfort in accepting that he wasn't what the world considers normal. And that's okay. Gordon would open a charity aimed to provide the treatment that saved his life to those who couldn't afford it, and really seemed to have his life back on track. Unfortunately, this thing did not end up being the happy ending story that we all hoped, as in 2022, similar issues that seemed to be in the past began to resurface. Gordon would be arrested at the Queens airport after repeatedly punching his 10-year-old son in the face for dropping his book bag. When it rains, it pours. As 1 month later, in November 2022, Gordon would be arrested once again after punching multiple McDonald's security guards. Before December 2022, Gordon would be once again hospitalized, this time for attempting to stab random civilians with sewing needles. Gordon would attempt to escape the hospital before being restricted. The final of Gordon's arrest would be made in April of 2023, after once again threatening to stab civilians in a juice shop in Connecticut. The downfall of Ben Gordon has been one that's just about as dark as they come, and all you can really do is pray that he receives the help that he needs before he and a whole lot of other people end up very hurt. The makings of one of sports' greatest dynasties had a couple of major pieces that were not named Michael Jordan. In fact, throughout their run, there were quite a few faces that came and went in between ring number 1 and ring number 6. And one of those faces you may or may not remember was NBA bruiser Bison Dele, or formerly known as Brian Williams. Bison was actually quite the player, having seen highs in his NBA career up north of 16 points per game, and with an NBA championship and a 9-year career, he was pretty alright in the grand scheme of things. What was different about Brian was the life of wealth and fame that came with the NBA didn't give him any sort of thrill. In fact, Brian actually left the game of basketball with an offer of $35 million on the table to pursue his real love of traveling the world. Seems to be a happy ending, right? But what if I told you that what comes next is one of the most bone-chilling events that you've ever heard? Born on Easter Sunday to a family that was anything but ordinary, Brian Williams and his older brother Kevin would never stay in one place for long, and that was due to the fact that their father was a part of a well-known music group. However, from the beginning, it was clear that the Williams family dynamic was not as rock-solid as it seemed from the outside, as their parents would divorce at an early age, leaving the boys fatherless for the majority of their lives. Brian spent the majority of his life as a track star until his sophomore year of high school came, when a massive growth spurt shooting up near 7 feet tall would essentially force him into basketball. And averaging 17 points, 13 rebounds, and 9 blocks a game, he clearly whooped every kid in the gym. Brian would go on to have a pretty solid 3 years playing for Maryland and Arizona. That was enough for him to earn the 10th overall pick in the 1991 NBA draft. Although making it to the top of the sport is a miraculous achievement to most, for Williams it just wasn't the same. Although Brian certainly displayed a lot of hard work to reach the NBA, Brian clearly just didn't have the love for the sport that you'd expect. There was a point during his NBA career where he was reading a biography of Miles Davis, and he began crying. Tom Tolbert was his teammate at the time, and he asked him why, and he just said, "I wish I had the passion for basketball that Miles has for music." Brian's career started off decent at 9 points per game with the Orlando Magic, but falling to just 4 points per game in his second year, Brian seemed to fall off the wagon a bit. At this time, Brian's struggles off the floor were interfering with his on-the-court production. Of course, these issues would be far more important than putting a ball in a basket, as Brian would be diagnosed with clinical depression as one of the first athletes to openly struggle with these kinds of issues. It was dark for Brian. After surviving an attempted overdose, crashing into a light post, and on multiple occasions attempting to jump out of team jets, Brian's life would certainly be plagued by his mental struggles. But on the court, Brian's game seemed to be bouncing back. After a 16-point, 7-rebound season and an NBA championship the year to follow, playing a crucial bench role for the Chicago Bulls, Williams would be rewarded with a fat 7-year, $45 million contract with the Detroit Pistons. All seemed to be going well for Brian, but in reality he was hating every minute of it. From the moment he was drafted to the moment he was ringed, it's hard to find a moment where it seemed that Brian was receiving a sense of joy from his NBA life. Even with the nightlife and women chasing scene, Brian seemed to have no interest in engaging in any of this behavior, to the point where his own teammates were speculating if this kid was gay. Brian didn't even really seem to enjoy the money aspect of his job. The only thing that Williams seems to enjoy was giving humongous 5 to 6 figure bonuses to ball boys or arena attendants, because these were the people that he felt he could relate to more so than his millionaire teammates. Brian was really pursuing giving back to the everyday person and experiencing all he could out of life in the off-season. Riding camels in Cairo, snorkeling in Australia, Brian seemed to be a bit reminiscent of the travel and adventure that came with having a musician father. After just 2 years into his 7-year contract, Brian decided that with the money he made in the NBA, he could pursue a life he wanted to live with the money that he made in his 9-year NBA career, retiring from the NBA with over $30 million over 5 years on the tape. Brian, at the blink of an eye, was out of sight, out of mind. After changing his name to Bison Dele to pay homage to his Native American ancestry, he was now traveling the world with his new girlfriend, experiencing whatever the world had to offer with his $20-some million fortune. Dele spent several months in Beirut, followed by visits to Europe, Indonesia, and India. He would DJ at nightclubs, jet ski in the Mediterranean, run with the Bulls, watching sunsets in Havana, and roamed in Istanbul. He played the saxophone, violin, and trumpet. Then he earned a pilot's license. It was the life that Williams had always dreamed of. Brian would set sail on his final voyage alongside the captain and his girlfriend, setting sail from Tahiti to Hawaii. All seemed to be going great in his life, now free of any stress, pressure, or restriction from living his best life, until Kevin Williams, the older brother of Brian, would step aboard the ship unexpectedly. See, Kevin and Brian were quite distant from one another. Kevin was also diagnosed with clinical depression and was known as quite the weirder, bitter loser of the pair. Brian had made a fortune and had unlocked the life of his dream, while Kevin was losing his money in get-rich-quick schemes like a grade-A moron and relying on the fountain of wealth that was his baby brother just to get by in life. Brian and Kevin would frequently feud, which made the surprise appearance even more out of the ordinary. It is assumed that what came next was all a part of Kevin's greater plan, but what came next exactly, we'll never know the exact details of. After departing for Hawaii, as the story goes, Brian and Kevin would get into frequent altercations that was very frightening for all on board, given that these two giants could rip an average man in half. Brian's girlfriend would frequently check in with family to give her whereabouts and speak on the terror and discomfort she felt in the middle of the family fight. With nowhere to hide on the seven seas, Brian and his girlfriend would go radio silent to all family, friends, or anyone they were in connection with, as Kevin Williams would return from the trip alone. Kevin would later be arrested after attempting to steal his older brother's identity to extract his fountain of wealth, in which he would admit to the murder of his younger brother. After presumably dumping the witnesses as well as his own bloodline into shark-infested waters, Kevin would return home, only to be released for a lack of evidence as the investigation pursued. Shortly after, Kevin would take his own life, ending the investigation and leaving behind a brutal trail of bodies that all led to the hands of one jealous, deranged, and pathetic individual. When it comes to NBA basketball, there's plenty of rags to riches stories from those growing up in communities torn apart by crime. But what happens when, despite making it to the top of professional basketball, that side never leaves you? Well, there is no example better than that of Reggie Harding, whose horrific actions and life of crime were so crazy that you could make a movie about it. In fact, they kinda actually did, as Marquise Johnson's role in White Man Can't Jump as the boneheaded criminal Raymond was actually based on the real-life story of Reggie Harding. The life of Harding started out in the streets of Detroit as his 17-year-old mother would be forced to put him up for adoption. Harding was always a very troubled kid, and to be more blunt, this kid was an absolute dickhead. He was a 6'5" freak in middle school that would beat up and pick on other kids. However, due to him being an absolute freak at basketball, he was always treated special around the block. However, his foster parents were much more worried about Reggie's behavior. Reggie would be sent to pick cherries on a farm for a summer at 17 years old, where the tables were turned. As the only black kid on the farm, he would routinely be picked on and harassed by the other kids to the point where he would steal the farmer's truck and drive himself home before being arrested for auto theft. Reggie would routinely find himself in trouble following his return. After winning 3 state championships, Harding was recognized as the greatest talent that has ever came out of Detroit. But what he was up to off the court made it impossible to cheer for this kid at all. Reggie would rack up some very serious charges and allegations his senior year of high school, starting with a statutory rape charge after having sex with a 15-year-old girl at 18 years old, which would be dropped after confirming that she consented to the act. Although the charges were dropped, the actions were confirmed to have occurred, in which you can draw your own conclusions. In the same but much darker vein, Reggie Harding was alleged of a very horrible crime by none other than Florence Ballard, world-famous singer out of the Detroit area from the music group known as the Supremes. In her own testimony, Florence claims that the two had been at a party during what would be Reggie's senior year of high school. As the two were from generally the same area, Reggie offered to drive Florence home after losing track of her brother who had drove her there to the function. And as Reggie essentially was a local celebrity at this point, she allowed it. Because, well, it was Reggie. Everyone knew Reggie. Reggie would unfortunately not drive Florence home that night, as in her account, he would drive her to an empty lot and rape her at knife point. Florence would suffer from depression and substance-related issues after the incident that greatly altered her quality of life before her very unfortunate passing at just 32 years old. Reggie would never be tried for the instance, nor would any investigation ever be done to verify these allegations. However, due to his track record, for good or for bad, this allegation is very widely believed. But again, I'm not here to tell you any conclusions. Reggie Harding's high school career would conclude with what he says was over 135 college offers. However, since this man was such a scholar, his grades were in fact too poor to even go to college, and was therefore drafted into the NBA, becoming the first player in league history to be drafted straight out of high school. I mean, if this guy doesn't show you that being talented doesn't mean you should be a role model, I don't know what else will convince you, but I digress. Harding would deal with legal issues as well as issues with the league's eligibility rule until he was redrafted by the Pistons in 1963. Suiting up for the following season, Reggie would proceed to be suspended for the start of the year for illegal firearm possession. Reggie was an immediate problem for Detroit, showing up drunk or on drugs to practice, then going back to the club shortly after. This thing was a mess, and his Detroit teammates really wanted nothing to do with him, and frankly, why would they? Reggie was horrifying. He would frequently bring guns into the locker room and point them at his teammates, one time even firing around at the feet of a teammate to make him dance like he's Tory Lanez. As his teammates didn't enjoy being around him for obvious reasons, Reggie would cry to his street friends as he felt that they thought they were better than him since Reggie never attended college. It was pretty pathetic, really. The school bully that treated the world like garbage and expected to be treated like a king. Reggie would go on to score over 10 points a game with 10 rebounds to pair in 2 years with Detroit. However, due to none of his teammates wanting to associate with him, Reggie found himself at odds with the law frequently throughout these 2 years, including cases for assaulting a police officer, in which he would be found guilty, and pulling a gun on a bouncer, which would be dropped. Reggie would be suspended for the entirety of the 1965-1966 season for actions detrimental to the league, which I would assume is either due to a combination of issues already covered or something behind the scenes that never surfaced. Regardless, with loads of time on his hands and being the guy that's in the NBA while also associating with criminals, Reggie was tied up with all the wrong people. At a time that the drug trade was rampant, Harding would receive free heroin from organized crime members due to his name and reputation, and developed a habit so bad that he wouldn't be able to fund it otherwise. Reggie would be welcomed back to the NBA after a single season of doing heroin and committing crimes, where he would be traded to the Chicago Bulls. Although the Bulls were well aware of how much of a cancer this guy could be, Harding was considered to be at minimum a top 5 center in the NBA, and was one of the very few guys that could physically match up to Bill and Wilt throughout the 1960s. Reggie would play pretty poor on the Bulls, but this fails in comparison to the impact that he caused in the locker room, as this poor bastard Flynn Robinson was the friend of sort, I guess, being forced to room with this head case. He would routinely be beaten, threatened to be pistol whipped, and even woke up looking eye to eye with Reggie, who had his iron sights between Flynn's eyelids. The final straw with the Bulls came as Harding would go radio silent from the roster for 2 weeks when his foster mother would pass away. And shortly after this, now back to the streets, Reggie would find himself in trouble again mid-season, serving jail time for gun possession just to be back out on the floor for the Indiana Pacers before the season even ended. After once again threatening to shoot his teammates, and even threatening to shoot the Pacers GM, Reggie would be finally released from the NBA for good after this 47th strike. Reggie would then spiral out of control following his NBA days as a guy with no money and a heroin dependency. As the old story goes, Reggie would rob the same convenience store 3 times, but at 7 feet tall, there wasn't exactly any hiding. After drawing his gun for the 3rd time, the cashier would call him out saying, "I know it's you, Reggie," before Reggie responded, "No, it isn't me." Reggie would face charges like gun possession, real shocker there, and drug-related charges before escaping police custody, only to return with bullet holes in both of his legs. After 1,000,001 gun-related issues, Reggie would be sentenced to 2.5 years in jail in 1969, shortly after his NBA run, where upon getting out of prison, he looked to be a whole new man. Now clean from his addiction, and now placing his family relationship first, while attending church twice a week. Although this guy did everything possible to mess up his life, at 30, I mean, anything's possible, I guess. Reggie had his goals set on making the NBA once again as he worked a factory job to put food on his family's table. Unfortunately, at this time, Reggie would receive the news that his biological mother was murdered after an argument with her boyfriend, where, in a very weird circumstance, Reggie would stand over top of the casket, talking to the funeral director for 15 minutes on how he would like his funeral to go. This was pretty weird behavior, of course, but what made this insane is what would occur just 2 weeks later. Harding would befriend a man by the name of Carl Scott, who quickly became very close friends with Reggie. Scott had just gotten out of prison as well, but seemed to be at least trying to get his life together, frequently going along with Reggie to church despite having one ear still to the street. Where this got weird was, after talking to a few women, Scott would randomly slap Reggie. Wondering why the hell he just did that, Scott wound up and slapped him again. Reggie would hold Scott over top of his head and kind of humiliate him in front of these women before Scott would drive away, before Reggie would break down crying for the way that his friend just treated him. Scott would return shortly after to the same location, drawing a pistol and aiming it at Reggie, before Reggie essentially told him to do his worst out of disbelief. And Scott did just that, pulling the trigger as Harding bled out, wondering what the hell just happened. before Scott would fire one more round, ending the Reggie Harding fiasco altogether. To this day, Reggie's legacy is relatively limited to the adequate stats that he put up in the league, and his son Reggie Harding Jr., who is currently serving life in prison for murder. An all-around deranged ending for an all-around deranged individual. When it comes to villains in the NBA, most of them in reality are just meaningless beefs we create in our heads because we get bored sometimes. Trae Young just shoots threes and plays bad defense, LeBron's worst crimes are lying about reading books, and Kevin Durant just made one of our hobbies less enjoyable for a few years. You may hate them while drinking beer on your futon, but if you saw them in person, you would quickly flip into their biggest fan, which I would probably do too. But what happened to those that actually live their lives as supervillains? Well, Fast Eddie Johnson is one of those monsters who did irreversible damage that will likely take generations to heal. Quickly, I want to make note that there were two Eddie Johnsons who have played in the NBA. There's Fast Eddie Johnson, who committed crimes that will probably get me demonetized. And then there's the Eddie Johnson that played his best days on the Sonics, Kings, and Royals throughout the 1980s and 90s, that now runs charities and gives back to single moms, so let's make sure we don't confuse the two. Eddie Johnson was a standout high school star from rural Florida that quickly began lighting college basketball on fire. At just under 22 points a game, this 6'2" guard was lightning quick his freshman year, could pull up from the mid-range and get to the line. All in all, this guy was just a nightmare to stay in front of, and could put up points in a hurry. Although the hot start to his career at Auburn, his freshman year would be the peak of his production, consistently dropping year after year down to 15 points per game as a senior. According to numerous sources, a main driver for this downfall would be his poor attitude, including the off-the-court issues and behind-the-scenes problems with his head coach, which limited his role as he grew sicker and sicker of Eddie. During this time, Johnson would frequently lash out at just about everyone. And in what's a very good fit for a mentally unstable college student, Eddie Johnson began ripping shit tons of cocaine. Johnson from the start was acting irrational in public, ruining personal relationships and passing out on the streets, so whatever personality trait that serves as that lock and key for drug addiction, Johnson had it, and had it big time. Despite his talent, Johnson was clearly a shithead, which would result in him being passed on 48 times in the 1977 NBA draft. But upon his entrance to the NBA, this guy was clearly the diamond in the rough. At 10 points his rookie year, it looked like this guy could play his role as a spark plug off the bench, and 16 points on good shooting his second year, it looked like this guy had the makings of a star. Johnson continued to climb, getting voted in as a starter in the All-Star game his third year in the NBA, alongside George Gervin, Julius Erving, and Larry Bird. This guy was on the way up, and he was moving fast. Scoring 22 on 11 for 16 shooting, Eddie Johnson managed to stand out as a scoring talent no matter how much talent you threw around him. Johnson was at the top of the best league in the world just 3 years after being the 49th pick, but as he realized that the hard part was really over, the old habits began to catch up with him. Johnson would be diagnosed with manic depression, in which he denies, the result of which doesn't help his cause at all, because starting in 1980, Johnson became a full-on maniac, committing a chain of crimes which derailed his life entirely. On the night of June 25th, 1980, Eddie had been in an apartment with some friends when two men broke down the door before weapons were drawn and gunfire was rained, forcing them and the others to flee by jumping from a second-story balcony. When police arrived, the altercation was cleared. Eddie told the police he had no reason why the two were out to get him. 2 days later, the police caught the man who had fired at Johnson, but because Eddie and his friends never showed up to press charges, the men were released from custody. College Park detective E.S. Mears, who handled the case, still doesn't understand why Eddie failed the show, and he maintains that there was a lot more to the incident than Johnson was willing to tell. A little birdie in one of the neighboring units of the apartment stated that Johnson had bought cocaine off of one of these men before, slapped around the woman who delivered it, and refused to pay. The story is unconfirmed, and the full details of this night, of course, would never have a chance to surface. Just a few weeks later, and Johnson would be pulled over with cocaine possession during a time that David Stern was handing out lifetime bans from the NBA. Due to a legal loophole, Johnson was able to avoid any punishment due to issues revolving around the legality of the search. With an increase in behavior that the Hawks were hoping was just in the past, Johnson would be checked into a psychiatric facility for a week of treatment, before Johnson would check himself out and immediately get arrested for stealing a Porsche from a dealership the day that he checked out. As the Hawks would try to get him the help he needed, Johnson would decide himself to quit medicating with what the psychiatric physicians prescribed him due to it affecting his play. And as his play continued to climb despite the controversies he was involved in, it was hard to deny him. Johnson would drop close to 20 and 5.5 a game in 1981. As his play thrived, 1981 is also where he began to fall off his rocker. Showing up to practice clearly out of it, fighting teammates, and getting distracted talking to fans and friends in the crowd, Johnson was showing the signs of a guy who was losing his mind. His own mother refers to his behavior as uneasy. He always had something to do, somewhere to be, and was waiting on somebody, while weight was falling off his frame like crazy. While putting up the best numbers of his career, Johnson was simultaneously acting deranged at practice, only to be carried away by police officers. 1981 would really be the peak of his career. It's unclear why exactly, as much of Eddie's off-the-court drama would not emerge throughout the bulk of his playing days, but after just 4 years in the NBA, Johnson's career would taper off, never reaching the levels he once played at, and never reaching the sky-high potential that seemed to be all but a guarantee. Johnson would play his final days in 1987 for the Seattle Supersonics, where at this time, Johnson's drug habits were becoming too tough to shake. Eddie would be forced to check into rehab, but after failing a drug test, Johnson would be banned from the NBA while on the last leg of his NBA career. This is where things really began to get ugly. Now as a drug addict who went from hundreds of thousands a year to $300 a week in pension from the NBA, Johnson was committing petty crimes to fund his addiction. From breaking into a pair of houses to sell belongings to buy crack rocks, stealing clothes from Target, and even at one point punching a police officer in the nose after being caught buying drugs from an undercover, Johnson would be arrested over 100 times following his exit from the NBA. Eddie was a great talent, great competitor, and very likable person. There were some concerns at the back end of his career with what was really going on. Well, despite how likable he was, Eddie Johnson was a living monster among us. He wasn't just another drug addict. Eddie Johnson would commit some atrocities so bad that I would go out and call him the biggest sack of shit that the NBA has ever seen. The following is going to be graphic, so again, viewer discretion is advised. Eddie Johnson continued his life of crime before it all came to a crashing halt in October 2008. Eddie Johnson would be accused of breaking into a Florida hotel home and a 25-year-old woman, to which charges would be filed. Less than 2 weeks later, Eddie Johnson went a step further. Breaking into a Florida apartment, Johnson would find an 8-year-old girl who was alone with her younger brothers. Johnson would order the girl to her room, where he would slide a cabinet over the door and proceed to rape her. Johnson would be found guilty of all charges in 2008, before serving out his life sentence and dying in prison at the age of 65 in 2020. From what we learned here today, all that glimmers certainly isn't gold. And despite the wealth and fame that come with reaching the top of professional basketball, this doesn't protect you from the evils that be. Make sure you check out this video here if you enjoyed this one, and let me know if you want a part 2 in the comments below.